They say you never realize you are bleeding to death if the cuts are small enough. In the emergency room, the young residents call it a death by 1,000 paper cuts. But the veterans, the ones who have been around long enough to see the light leave a person's eyes, know it by its true name, the slow seep. It is the microscopic, localized damage that you ignore because you are too busy looking for the gaping wound. You look for the trauma you can see, the shattered femur, the lacerated liver, the arterial spray. You don't look for the quiet internal bleed that slowly drops your blood pressure, drop by drop, hour by hour, until the monitors start screaming and it is far too late to do anything but call the time of death. I spent 35 years of my life as a trauma nurse at County General Hospital. 35 years of working double shifts under flickering fluorescent lights that gave me a permanent throbbing migraine. 35 years of breathing in the sharp, sterile scent of bleach that never quite managed to cover up the underlying metallic smell of blood and desperation. I knew how to triage. I knew how to stop a hemorrhage. I knew exactly how to save a life when the universe was doing everything in its power to take it away. But I did not know how to save myself, not from the people I loved most. My name is Sonia. I am 62 years old, an African-American woman who has lived long enough to see the world change, though some things, like the sharp sting of disrespect, remain eternally the same. My husband, Marcus, passed away from pancreatic cancer when our daughter, Sarah, was just 14 years old. It was a vicious, fast-moving illness. One minute we were standing in the driveway, arguing over whose turn it was to clean the autumn leaves out of the gutters. And 6 months later, I was standing in a freezing cemetery, picking out a mahogany casket that cost more than my first car. After Marcus died, my entire universe shrank down to one single breathing focal point. Sarah. It was just me and my baby girl against the world. I made a promise to my husband as they lowered him into the muddy earth in the pouring rain. I promised him, whispering into the collar of my black wool coat, that our daughter would never want for anything. I promised that she would go to a good college, get her degree, and have the kind of comfortable, secure life that Marcus and I had to scrape, claw, and bleed for. And Lord knows I kept that promise. I worked every holiday, every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every 4th of July. I was in the ER. I picked up overtime shifts whenever another nurse called out sick with the flu or a hangover. By the time I hit my 50s, my feet ached with a deep, bone-deep throb at the end of every 12-hour shift. I spent my evenings soaking them in a plastic tub of hot water and Epsom salts just to bring the feeling back to my toes. But every time I looked at Sarah's report cards, every time I paid another semester's tuition, every time I saw her walk across that university stage to receive her degree in marketing, the physical pain in my joints vanished. She was my heart, walking around outside of my chest. When Sarah met David, I was genuinely thrilled. He was polite, well-spoken, and wore a sharp suit to his corporate finance job. When he came to my small apartment, he always brought flowers, and more importantly, he looked at my daughter like she was the only woman in the room. When they got married, I was the one crying the hardest in the front pew of the church, dabbing at my eyes with a lace handkerchief, thanking God that my daughter had found a good man to protect her. But then, a year into their marriage, the harsh reality of this modern economy hit them like a freight train. They wanted to buy a house, to start a family, but the real estate market was ruthless. Sarah would call me on her lunch breaks, weeping in frustration, telling me they had been outbid by all cash buyers for the 4th time that month. She told me they were going to be stuck in their cramped, noisy, one-bedroom apartment forever, throwing their money away on rent while their dreams died on the vine. I couldn't bear to hear her cry. You see, a mother's instinct does not simply evaporate when her child turns 25 and gets a marriage license. You see your child hurting, and your immediate primal thought is, how can I fix this? What can I give? I had my 401k. It was the retirement fund Marcus and I had started putting meager amounts of money into when we were in our 20s, back when $20 a week felt like a fortune. Over the decades, through sheer discipline and the miracle of compound interest, it had grown. That money was supposed to take me on a cruise to the Bahamas. It was supposed to guarantee that I wouldn't be working at a grocery store checkout lane in my 70s. I had nearly $300,000 saved up. It was my safety net, my freedom. So I did what any mother who loves her child entirely too much would do. I offered to buy them the house, outright. No 30-year mortgage, no predatory interest rates, no bank breathing down their necks. Just a clean, fresh start. A foundation for generational wealth, something my own parents could never have dreamed of giving me. I remember the day we signed the preliminary papers. My lawyer, Mr. Henderson, an old friend from my church who had handled Marcus's life insurance, had pulled me aside before we went into the polished glass conference room. Marcus Henderson was an older, pragmatic man with a gravelly voice and eyes that had seen too many families tear each other apart over money. He looked at me with deep concern. "Sonia," he had said, his voice low and urgent, "I have known you for 20 years. I know how much you love that girl, but you are draining your retirement. You are giving away your armor. I am advising you strongly to keep this deed strictly in your name. Let them live there. Let them decorate it. But protect your asset. You are too close to retirement to play games with this kind of money. If God forbid something happens to their marriage, or to you, that house needs to be legally yours." I felt a sharp prickle of guilt even agreeing to it. What kind of mother doesn't trust her own child? What kind of mother holds a legal safety hatch over her daughter's head? But the nurse in me, the woman who spent decades preparing for the absolute worst-case scenario in the trauma bay, nodded her head. When I sat Sarah down in my tiny kitchen and told her the house would be in my name for the time being, citing tax purposes and legal protection, she barely blinked. She didn't care about the name on the county clerk's paper. She just threw her arms around my neck and hugged me so tightly I could barely draw breath. "Oh, Mama," she had cried, tears of pure joy streaming down her face. "Thank you. Thank you so much. It's our house, Mama, and we are going to have a room just for you. The guest room upstairs, the one overlooking the garden with the big bay window. It'll be your room. You can come over whenever you want. You won't even have to knock. Whenever you want." That was the promise. The verbal contract sealed with a kiss on the cheek. The house we found was a beautiful, sprawling 4-bedroom colonial in a very nice, very quiet, and very expensive suburb called Whispering Pines. It had original hardwood floors, gleaming granite countertops, and a massive backyard with a weeping willow tree that dipped its branches toward the grass. It was a dream. But dreams have a funny, cruel way of turning into nightmares when you aren't paying close attention to the shadows in the corners of the room. The shift in my daughter's life, and consequently in mine, did not happen overnight. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly, when David's mother, Vivian Sterling, officially entered the picture as a daily fixture in their lives. Vivian was a piece of work. She was a wealthy widow who lived in a gated luxury condo community across town. She was the kind of woman who wore immaculate St. John knits and a string of authentic pearls just to go to the high-end organic grocery store. She spoke with a breathless, airy tone that made you feel as though you were holding her up from a very important charity gala, even if she was just standing in a driveway. She drove a pristine white Lexus SUV and made sure everyone within a 5-mile radius knew that she sat on the board of 3 different philanthropic foundations. I had met her a few times before the wedding, and we had always exchanged polite, shallow pleasantries. But it was at the first official dinner party at the new house on Maplewood Drive that I really saw her, the real Vivian. I had arrived early that Saturday afternoon to help Sarah cook. I brought my heavy, seasoned cast-iron skillet to fry some chicken, exactly the way Sarah had loved it since she was a little girl. I had spent the morning marinating the meat in buttermilk and spices, a labor of love that I was excited to share in their new kitchen. But when I walked through the front door, the house did not smell of home cooking. It smelled of expensive floral arrangements and lemon polish. Vivian was already there, standing in the kitchen holding a crystal glass of sparkling water, directing 2 men in white uniforms who were unpacking silver catering trays. Vivian turned to look at me as I walked in holding my grocery bags. Her eyes darted to the cast-iron skillet and then to the plastic-wrapped container of raw chicken. Her smile was smooth, dripping with Southern-style honey, but her eyes were as cold as ice. "Oh, Sonia, dear," she cooed, pressing a hand to her chest in mock surprise. "I didn't know you were coming over so early. And oh my, you brought raw poultry into the house. How incredibly domestic." I stopped in my tracks, my grip tightening on the handles of the grocery bags. "It's for the fried chicken, Vivian," I said, keeping my tone polite but firm. "It's Sarah's favorite. I thought we were doing a family potluck for their first weekend here." Vivian let out a soft, condescending laugh that sounded like silver bells chiming in a winter wind. "A potluck? Oh, sweetheart, no. This is David and Sarah's first dinner party in their new home. They are officially homeowners now. We simply couldn't risk the smell of frying grease getting into those beautiful custom drapes I helped Sarah pick out. I've ordered a lovely roasted duck with a cherry glaze from Pierre's downtown. But don't worry, I'm sure David can wrap that chicken up and freeze it for one of their busy weeknights. I looked past Vivian to see my daughter. Sarah was standing near the sink, wiping down a perfectly clean counter with a microfiber cloth. My daughter, the girl who used to beg me to make that very chicken every Sunday after church, just stood there. She wrung her hands together, her shoulders hunched, refusing to make eye contact with me. "Mama," Sarah said, her voice nervous and placating. "Maybe we can just put it in the fridge for now?" Vivian went through a lot of trouble coordinating with the caterer. "We want everything to be perfect tonight." Vivian went through a lot of trouble. I stood there in the kitchen I had purchased, holding the food my daughter used to love, listening to her prioritize the aesthetic of her mother-in-law's drapes over my presence. Vivian hadn't put a single dime toward the walls protecting those drapes, yet she was directing the show. I swallowed the heavy, painful lump forming in my throat. I forced my mouth into a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Of course, baby," I said quietly. I walked over to the stainless steel refrigerator and put the chicken inside. That was the first cut. Over the next few months, the cuts kept coming, each one slightly deeper, slightly more brazen than the last. I would come over on a Sunday afternoon, using the spare key Sarah had insisted I take, only to find the guest room, my room, slowly being colonized. First, it was a few hat boxes in the closet. Then a rolling garment rack appeared, stuffed to the breaking point with Vivian's sequined evening gowns and heavy winter coats wrapped in dry cleaner plastic. Finally, a set of custom monogrammed golf clubs in a pink leather bag took up residence in the corner. When I gently asked Sarah about it, she brushed it off with a sigh of annoyance. "Oh, Mama, please don't make a big deal out of it. Vivian is having some minor renovations done at her condo, and she just needed some extra storage space for her off-season wardrobe. It's temporary. You can just sleep on the pull-out couch in the finished basement if you ever need to stay over." The basement. I was being relegated to the basement in the house that had drained my life savings. I tried to tell myself I was being an overly sensitive old woman. I reasoned that I was suffering from empty nest syndrome, that I needed to let my daughter fly and establish her own boundaries. I tried to be the bigger person, relying on my faith and my patience to see me through this awkward transition period. But Vivian was relentless. She was a master of passive aggression. Her classism was a weapon she wielded with terrifying precision. She never used slurs, she never raised her voice, but she used 1,000 little social daggers to remind me that I was working class, that I had rough hands, and that I did not belong in the glossy, upper-middle-class aesthetic she was curating for her son and his wife. The breaking point, the moment the bleeding became too heavy to ignore, arrived in the first week of November. The weather had turned bitterly cold, the autumn leaves dead and rotting on the frost-covered lawns. I decided I was not going to let Vivian push me out of my own family traditions. For 20 years, Marcus and I had made a peach cobbler every fall. It was a recipe passed down from my grandmother in Georgia. It required real, full-fat butter, fresh peaches blanched and peeled by hand, a lattice crust made from scratch, and enough nutmeg to make the whole house smell like a warm, enveloping hug. It was a dessert that held the soul of my family. I spent 4 hours in the tiny kitchen of my apartment making that cobbler. I carefully wrapped the heavy glass baking dish in tin foil, placed it in a thermal carrier, and drove over to the house on Maplewood Drive for Sunday dinner. I didn't call ahead. I had a key. I was her mother. When I walked through the front door, the house did not smell of roasting meat or baking bread. It smelled of lavender diffusers and sterile perfection. I walked into the living room. Vivian was sitting on the center of the massive white sectional sofa, a sofa I had paid a $2,000 deposit on, holding a crystal wine glass filled with Pinot Grigio. David and Sarah were sitting in the armchairs opposite her, leaning forward, hanging on to her every word. "And so I told the contractor," Vivian was saying, laughing her airy musical laugh, "if it isn't authentic Italian marble, don't even bother bringing the samples into my house." David chuckled and Sarah smiled eagerly. They were an audience captivated by their wealthy matriarch. Then they saw me. I was standing in the foyer, wearing my sensible knit sweater and orthopedic shoes, holding a thermal carrier that looked like it belonged at a church picnic. The laughter died instantly. The silence in the room was deafening. "Sonia," David said, standing up quickly, looking painfully awkward. Hi. We didn't know you were coming over." "It's Sunday, David," I said. stepping into the room and trying to keep the warmth in my voice. Sarah and I always have Sunday dinner. I brought Marcus's peach cobbler. It's still piping hot from the oven. Vivian slowly lowered her wine glass. She didn't stand up. She simply turned her head and looked at me. Her eyes scanned me from the top of my natural hair down to the scuffs on my shoes before landing on the dish in my hands. "Oh, Sonia," Vivian said, her voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet pity. "How rustic. You know, you really shouldn't have gone to the trouble of baking all afternoon." "It's no trouble, Vivian," I replied, holding the dish slightly higher, my knuckles turning white. "It's a family recipe, Marcus's favorite. Sarah loves it. Right, baby?" I looked at my daughter. I pleaded with her, communicating entirely with my eyes. "Just say yes. Just stand up for me this once. Tell this woman that our history means more than her approval." Sarah shifted uncomfortably on the couch. She looked at Vivian, then at David, and finally down at her own lap. "Mama," Sarah said, her voice tight and defensive, "we actually already ate. Vivian brought over some sushi from that new high-end place downtown, and she ordered these amazing little French macarons for dessert. They're being delivered any minute." I felt the smile freeze on my face. Sushi? For a Sunday family dinner? Vivian sighed dramatically, resting a manicured hand on her chest as if explaining a basic concept to a slow child. "Well, Sonia, David's doctor mentioned he needs to start watching his cholesterol. And honestly, all that heavy butter and refined sugar in your cobbler, it's just so terrible for the heart. We prefer a much cleaner, refined diet in this house. But I'm sure it's a very lovely, very quaint little dish. Maybe you can take it to the nurse's station at your public hospital tomorrow. I'm sure the staff there would appreciate the extra calories." Quaint, heavy, take it to the staff. A sharp, high-pitched ringing sound erupted in my ears, like the onset of severe tinnitus. All the ambient noise in the room, the hum of the refrigerator, the wind outside, the ticking of the grandfather clock, faded away entirely. In the emergency room, when a patient codes and goes into cardiac arrest, there is a fraction of a second of absolute, terrifying stillness before the chaos erupts. Time stops. You see everything in the room with hyper-realistic crystal clarity. In that moment, standing in the middle of a $300,000 house that my blood, sweat, and 35 years of saving had paid for, holding a cobbler that contained the memory of the only man who ever truly loved me, I saw the truth. I was not a mother to them anymore. I was an embarrassment. I was the working-class black woman with calloused hands who didn't fit into the glossy country club aesthetic Vivian was meticulously building for her son. And my daughter, my beautiful, college-educated, privileged daughter whose entire life was built on my back, was letting her do it. "I see," I said. My voice was low, devoid of any emotion. Sensing the dangerous shift in the atmosphere, Sarah stood up. "Mama, don't be like that. Just put it in the fridge. David can take it to work for lunch tomorrow." I looked dead into Sarah's eyes. "You want him to eat your father's cobbler cold out of a Tupperware container in a corporate break room?" Sarah groaned, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling in sheer exasperation. "God, Mama, why do you always have to make everything a tragedy? It's just a pie. Vivian is just trying to help us be healthier. Why can't you just get along and not be so dramatic?" "It's just a pie." I didn't yell. I didn't scream. When you yell, you give them the power to label you as the angry black woman. You give them the ammunition to call you crazy, emotional, and irrational. I walked past them, into the kitchen with the imported subway tile backsplash I had approved and paid for. I set the heavy glass dish on the marble island. I looked at my reflection in the stainless steel appliances. I looked old. I looked bone-tired. I looked like a woman who had poured out every drop of water from her own cup to hydrate someone else, only to watch them spit it out onto the floor because it wasn't sparkling water from France. I walked over to the kitchen sink and turned on the hot water. I washed my hands with antibacterial soap, scrubbing them vigorously, precisely the way I would scrub out after dealing with a highly infectious patient. Because that is exactly what I needed to do. I needed to cut the infection out of my life before it killed me. I dried my hands on a monogrammed towel, one that read V&D, Vivian having completely ignored Sarah's name when she bought them, and walked back out to the living room. The doorbell was ringing. The delivery driver with the overpriced macarons had arrived. "I'm going to head out," I said, my tone perfectly even and professional. Sarah looked up from the pastel boxes David was bringing in. "You're leaving? Mama, you just got here. You don't want a macaron?" "No," I said. "I'm going home. I'm tired." Vivian didn't even look up from her wine glass. "Drive safely, Sonia. In your neighborhood, you really shouldn't be out too late anyway." I didn't respond. I turned on my heel, walked out the front door, and locked it behind me with my silver key. When I reached my 10-year-old Honda Civic, the car I had refused to upgrade so I could ensure Sarah had enough money for a down payment on her own first car, I got into the driver's seat and simply stared at the steering wheel. I did not shed a single tear. The time for crying had passed. Vivian thought she was dealing with an uneducated, soft-hearted old woman she could easily bully into the shadows. Sarah thought she was dealing with a mother who would swallow any indignity, endure any humiliation, just to remain close to her child. They had both forgotten who they were dealing with. I spent 3.5 decades making split-second life-or-death decisions. I knew how to read the vital signs. I knew how to spot the undeniable symptoms of a failing organ. My relationship with my daughter was a failing organ. It was necrotic. It was actively poisoning my spirit. And if there is one thing a veteran trauma nurse knows how to do without hesitation, it is amputate. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving the peach cobblers sitting on their immaculate counter. Let them throw it away. Let them laugh behind my back. Tomorrow was Monday, and on Monday morning, I was going to make a phone call to Mr. Henderson. The bleeding stopped tonight. In the emergency room, when a patient comes through the double doors after a catastrophic physical trauma, a high-speed collision, a severe fall, a crushing blow, they rarely report feeling any immediate pain. It is a biological mercy. The body, in its infinite wisdom, floods the central nervous system with adrenaline and cortisol, creating a temporary chemical fortress against the agony. They will sit on the gurney, perfectly lucid, chatting with the triage nurses and insisting that they are absolutely fine, completely unaware that their internal organs are quietly bleeding out and their blood pressure is plummeting toward a fatal threshold. The pain always comes later, when the shock finally wears off and the body is forced to reckon with the reality of its own brokenness. The 2 weeks following the peach cobbler incident felt exactly like that physiological shock. I did not call Sarah, and she did not call me. The silence stretched out between us like a long, sterile hospital corridor. Every single day that passed without my phone ringing, without a text message asking how I was doing, was another invisible drop in my emotional blood pressure. A part of me, the soft, motherly part that I had nurtured for decades, was waiting for her to realize what had happened. I was waiting for her to show up at my apartment, contrite and tearful, to apologize, to say, "Mama, I was wrong. I'm sorry. You belong at our table. You belong in our lives." But my phone remained dead on the kitchen counter. By the second week of November, the protective numbness of the shock began to wear off, and the deep, throbbing ache of reality set in. It was a bitterly cold, relentlessly rainy Tuesday. I had the day off from the clinic where I occasionally volunteered, and I found myself sitting in my small living room, staring blankly at the beige walls, feeling the 4 corners of the apartment closing in on me. I needed an excuse to leave. I told myself I needed to retrieve a heavy navy blue wool cardigan I had left at the house a month prior. But it wasn't really about the sweater, and I knew it. I needed to see my daughter's face. I needed to stand in the same room with her and figure out if I was losing my mind, overreacting to a minor slight, or if I was truly losing my child to a woman who viewed us both as beneath her. I drove over around noon. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, and the rain lashed aggressively against my windshield. I knew David was at his corporate finance office downtown, and Sarah worked from home on Tuesdays, analyzing marketing data from her laptop. I parked my Honda Civic in the wide paver-stone driveway, pulled my raincoat tight against the freezing wind, and used my silver key to open the heavy oak front door. The house was incredibly quiet, save for the faint, muffled sound of a Zoom meeting playing on a laptop speaker down the hall in David's home office. I didn't want to interrupt Sarah while she was working. I figured I would just walk quietly upstairs to the guest room, my room, the room she had promised me, grab my cardigan from the closet and wait for her in the kitchen to put on a pot of coffee. I walked up the sweeping hardwood staircase, my hand trailing lightly along the polished mahogany banister. My knees ached a little with the damp weather, a persistent souvenir from 35 years of standing on hard linoleum floors. I walked down the carpeted hallway, turned the brass knob to the guest room, and pushed the door open. I froze in the doorway. My hand refused to let go of the knob. The bed, The beautiful dark-wood queen-sized bed with the expensive orthopedic mattress I had specifically purchased for my bad back was completely gone. In its place stood 3 heavy-duty rolling garment racks, stuffed to the absolute breaking point with designer clothing. There were sequined evening gowns, heavy mink coats, and rows of silk blouses wrapped in clear dry cleaner plastic. On the floor, occupying the exact space where my bedside table used to sit, were towering precarious stacks of pristine white and black shoe boxes. Jimmy Choo, Prada, Christian Louboutin. In the far corner, leaning against the custom wainscoting I had paid a contractor to install, sat a set of custom-made monogrammed golf clubs housed in a ridiculous pink leather bag. And then there was the smell. The entire room reeked of Chanel No. 5 in sheer unadulterated entitlement. It was Vivian's signature scent, heavy and suffocating. My chest tightened so fiercely I had to remind myself to inhale. It wasn't a guest room anymore. It wasn't my safe haven. It had been gutted and transformed into a monument to Vivian's vanity. The room Sarah had looked me in the eye and promised was mine, in the house that had drained my life savings, had been casually repurposed to store the seasonal overflow of a wealthy woman's shopping addiction. I forced myself to walk into the room. I moved toward the built-in closet. I had claimed one single drawer in that closet, a small space where I had kept a few changes of comfortable clothes, a pair of reading glasses, a couple of nursing magazines, and most importantly, a silver-framed photograph of Marcus. It was a picture taken on our 10th anniversary, his smile wide and full of life. I pulled the drawer open. It was empty, wiped completely clean. Panic, hot and sharp, spiked in my chest. Where was the photo? They could throw away my clothes. They could banish my bed, but they had no right to touch my husband. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the sharp pain in my joints, and began frantically searching the floor of the closet. I found it shoved into a dusty, unmarked cardboard box in the darkest, furthest corner of the closet, buried unceremoniously under a tangled pile of Vivian's old, discarded winter scarves and a pair of scuffed riding boots. I pulled the frame out. The glass was smeared with dust. I wiped Marcus's smiling face clean with the sleeve of my raincoat. My hand was trembling violently, but as I stared at the picture, the panic evaporated, replaced instantly by a rage so pure, so concentrated, and so absolute that it felt like ice water in my veins. "Mama, what are you doing up here?" I turned around slowly, still on my knees, clutching the silver frame to my chest. Sarah was standing in the doorway, holding a ceramic coffee mug, wearing expensive cashmere loungewear. She looked startled, her eyes darting around the room, taking in the rolling racks and then looking down at me on the floor. She looked like a deer caught in the headlights. Good. She should be. I stood up, brushing the dust from my knees. My voice, when I finally spoke, was eerily calm. "I came to get my blue cardigan, but it seems I don't live here anymore." Sarah sighed heavily, running a hand through her perfectly styled hair. Her shock immediately morphed into irritation. "Mama, please don't do this right now. I just got off a really stressful conference call. Vivian had some unexpected plumbing renovations happening at her condo, and she just needed a dry, safe place to store her off-season wardrobe so it wouldn't get ruined. It's totally temporary." I stepped toward her, my eyes locked onto hers with unwavering intensity. "Temporary? You took my bed out, Sarah. You dismantled the furniture I bought. You threw your father's picture in a cardboard box under her old coats." "I didn't throw it!" Sarah's voice rose, shrill and defensive. "I carefully packed it away so it wouldn't get broken while the movers were bringing the racks in. Why are you always looking for a fight? You never even sleep here anyway. You've stayed over exactly twice in 6 months." "Because every single time I step foot in this house, I am made to feel like the help," I said, my voice dropping an octave, deadly serious. "I am treated like a nuisance, a trespasser in the home I bought with my own sweat and blood." Sarah groaned loudly, rolling her eyes in a display of adolescent petulance that looked absurd on a grown, married woman. "Oh my God, here we go with the guilt trip again. The house I bought. You hold that over our heads every single chance you get. If you didn't want to help us, you shouldn't have offered the money in the first place. David's mom never makes us feel guilty when she helps us out." The words hung in the air between us, thick and poisonous. David's mom never makes us feel guilty when she helps us out. I stared at my daughter, absorbing the sheer, breathtaking audacity of that statement. Vivian didn't help them. Vivian bought $500 sushi dinners. Vivian bought $1,000 silk drapes to mark her territory. Vivian bought expensive macaroons to show off her refined palate. But Vivian had not put a single solitary dime toward the roof over their heads. Vivian had not worked 70 hours a week for decades to secure their future. I looked at Sarah's defensive posture, her crossed arms, the stubborn jut of her chin. She was no longer my little girl. She was a stranger, utterly brainwashed by a woman who would not cross the street to spit on her if she were on fire. "You're right, Sarah," I said softly with terrifying finality. "I shouldn't hold it over your head. I won't mention the house again." Caught entirely off guard by my sudden uncharacteristic retreat, Sarah's posture relaxed slightly, her tone softening into a patronizing placation. "Look, Mama, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to snap at you. Things are just really tight and stressful right now. David is stressed about finances at work, and Vivian is dealing with some personal things with her foundation. We're all just on edge. Let me buy you lunch this weekend, okay? We can go to that bistro you like." "Sure, baby," I said, my face a carefully constructed mask of pleasantry. "Lunch. I'll see myself out." I walked past her, down the sweeping staircase. I needed a pen to leave a quick note for their mail carrier regarding a misdelivered package I had noticed on the porch on my way in. I stepped into David's home office on the first floor. It was a spacious room with a heavy mahogany desk, but it was incredibly messy. David was a meticulous accountant for a massive corporate firm, but his personal workspace looked like a disaster zone. There were stacks of manila folders, unopened mail, and coffee rings staining the expensive wood. I opened the top right drawer of his desk, searching for a simple ballpoint pen. My hand did not find a pen. Instead, my fingers brushed against a thick, heavy stack of bank statements held tightly together by a black binder clip. Now let me tell you something about being an ER nurse. Over the years, you develop a highly specialized, almost supernatural eye for anomalies. You can look at a patient's chart with 100 different numbers and metrics on it, and the one abnormal lab result will jump out at you as if it were glowing in the dark. The top statement on the stack was not from David and Sarah's joint checking account. It was a credit card statement, a Platinum American Express bill. The name printed at the top in bold black letters read, "Vivian Sterling." I knew I shouldn't have looked. I am a woman who respects boundaries and privacy. But the universe has a funny, deliberate way of placing the unvarnished truth right into your hands when you finally have the stomach required to handle it. I picked up the statement. The total balance due was staggering, $64,212. I flipped to the second page, my eyes scanning the itemized charges. There were transactions from luxury boutiques in Paris, exorbitant charges from 5-star ski resorts in Aspen, massive bills from high-end interior decorators, and thousands of dollars spent at exclusive country clubs. It was the itemized lifestyle of the rich and famous, but it was the payment section at the bottom of the page that made my breath catch violently in my throat. Payment received, $4,500. Source, joint checking account, David and Sarah Sterling. My hands began to shake. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I put the American Express statement down on the desk and grabbed the thick manila folder sitting directly underneath it. The tab was neatly labeled in David's handwriting, V.S. Financial Restructuring. I opened the folder. Inside were dozens of wire transfer receipts, stacked chronologically, month after month after month. $2,000 here, $5,000 there, $7,000 to cover a tax emergency. All of the money was flowing directly from my daughter's joint checking account into an LLC solely owned by Vivian. I flipped further back into the folder, digging through the financial history. I went back exactly 2 years. Right to the month before Sarah had come to my apartment, weeping on my sofa, telling me they were desperate to buy a house but couldn't possibly afford the down payment in the current market. There, near the bottom of the stack, was a bank statement from Sarah and David's own high-yield savings account from that exact month. I stared at the ending balance line, $120,000. They had the money. They had the money for a massive down payment. They had more than enough to buy a beautiful home on their own. I stared at the numbers until the ink blurred and swam before my eyes. My mind, trained by decades of processing complex medical trauma with rapid speed, put the pieces of the puzzle together with horrifying, devastating efficiency. They didn't come to me, crying and begging for help, because they were broke. They came to me because David's mother was drowning in a sea of debt. Vivian's charity galas, her imported luxury cars, her designer clothes, her entire aristocratic persona. It was all a fragile house of cards built on credit. She was flat broke, and David, the dutiful, enabling son, was quietly draining his and Sarah's savings to bail her out, to keep up the facade of the wealthy, untouchable matriarch for her country club friends. And Sarah, my sweet, educated Sarah, let him do it. Instead of sitting Vivian down, looking her in the eye, and telling her to sell her luxury condo and cut up her credit cards, they came to me. They let an aging, exhausted ER nurse empty out 35 years of blood, sweat, and graveyard shifts, just so Vivian could keep her precious, hollow image intact. My retirement money didn't buy my daughter a house. It subsidized Vivian's luxury lifestyle. I felt a physical sickness wash over me, a nausea so profound and heavy I had to grip the sharp edge of the mahogany desk to keep my knees from buckling to the floor. David's mom never makes us feel guilty when she helps us out. She wasn't helping them. They were funding her. And I was funding them. I was the absolute bottom of the pyramid. The unwitting workhorse. The fool. I looked at the documents again. I reached into my purse and pulled out my cell phone. My hands, which had been shaking moments before, were perfectly, eerily steady now. The shock was completely over. The adrenaline had burned away. All that was left in its wake was cold, surgical precision. I opened the camera app. I took photos of everything. The massive Amex statements, the wire transfers, the damning bank balances. Snap, snap, snap. The digital shutter sound was the only noise in the quiet, empty office. When I was finished, I put the papers back exactly as I had found them, ensuring the binder clip was perfectly aligned. I closed the desk drawer softly. I didn't leave a note for the mailman. I walked out of the office, out the heavy oak front door, and stepped out into the pouring November rain. When I sat down in the driver's seat of my Honda Civic, the sound of the rain beating against the windshield sounded entirely different. It didn't sound gloomy or depressing anymore. It sounded like a torrential, cleansing wash. I am a woman who believes deeply in forgiveness. I believe in grace. I have spent my life offering care to those who are hurting. But I also believe, with every fiber of my medical training, that a cancer left untreated will inevitably kill the host. Sarah and David thought they had played a brilliant, victimless game. They thought they had successfully secured their perfect suburban life, a beautiful colonial home, and Vivian's glowing approval, all quietly paid for by the invisible, unacknowledged labor of the black woman they had shoved out of sight into the basement. But they had made a fatal, arrogant error. They forgot who actually held the title to the chessboard. I pulled my phone out of my raincoat pocket and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice before he picked up. "Law Office of Marcus Henderson," the familiar, raspy voice answered. "Marcus," I said, my voice as cold as ice and as sharp as a surgical scalpel. "It's Sonia." "Sonia, how are you doing, my friend?" "I need to see you, today. Clear your afternoon schedule." There was a pause on the line. Marcus was a smart man. He heard the dangerous shift in my tone. "Is everything okay, Sonia? Are you in trouble?" "No, Marcus," I said, staring through the rain-slicked windshield at the house I owned. "I'm not in trouble, but somebody is about to be. I need you to pull the deed for the house on Maplewood Drive." "The deed? Sonia, what are you planning to do?" I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. My eyes were hard, unyielding, and completely awake. "I'm planning to amputate," I said. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. In the field of medicine, there is a terrifying term we use to describe the worst kind of disease: insidious onset. It refers to a pathology that develops so gradually, so quietly beneath the surface of the skin, that by the time you actually begin to notice the symptoms, the malignancy has already taken root deep inside the bone. You cannot simply put a bandage on an insidious disease. You cannot cure it with a mild course of antibiotics or a few days of bed rest. You have to cut deep. You have to endure the pain of the scalpel, and you have to expose the rotting tissue to the harsh, unforgiving light of the operating room. After I left David's home office that rainy afternoon, armed with the digital photographs of his bank statements and his mother's crippling credit card debt, I did not immediately confront them. Confrontation is a messy, emotional endeavor reserved for people who are desperately seeking an apology or a tearful reconciliation. I no longer wanted an apology. I wanted the absolute truth, in its entirety, no matter how profoundly ugly it was. So I waited. I played my part. I became the perfect picture of the docile, unassuming, aging mother. By the second week of December, the city had transformed into a winter wonderland. The streets were lined with twinkling lights, the storefronts were draped in heavy evergreen garlands, and the local grocery stores were playing the same 5 cheerful carols on an endless, maddening loop. I was sitting at my small Formica kitchen table, methodically signing my annual Christmas cards, when my cell phone finally buzzed with a call from Sarah. Christmas Eve had always been our sacred time. Since Marcus passed away, the holiday had been whittled down to just the 2 of us. Every year, without fail, I would spend hours preparing a massive honey-baked ham with cloves and brown sugar. We would put on our matching flannel pajamas, drink hot apple cider, watch classic holiday movies until our eyes grew heavy, and open exactly 1 present each at the stroke of midnight. It was a modest tradition, but it was warm, and it was ours. "Hey, Mama, how are you?" Sarah's voice chirped through the phone speaker. It was tight and overly bright, carrying the distinct cadence of someone who was reading from a carefully rehearsed script. "I'm fine, Sarah," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level as I capped my pen. "Just addressing the holiday cards for the girls at the clinic. How is David doing?" "Oh, he's good. Really busy with year-end tax stuff at the firm, you know how it is," she babbled quickly, eager to get through the pleasantries. "Listen, Mama, I'm actually calling about Christmas Eve." "What about it, baby?" I asked gently. "I've already ordered the ham from the butcher. It's a 10-pounder this year." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a nervous, fluttering laugh. "Yeah, about that. So, Vivian decided she wants to host a formal Christmas Eve dinner at our house this year. She's inviting a few prominent couples from her country club and the senior board members from her charity foundation. She hired a private chef to do a 6-course tasting menu and a string quartet. It's going to be a whole event." I sat perfectly still, staring at a picture of a snow-covered manger on the card in front of me. "I see," I said quietly. "In my house." Sarah sighed, the familiar tone of adolescent annoyance creeping instantly back into her voice. "Mama, please, let's not do the my house thing right now. Anyway, it's going to be a very formal, sit-down, plated dinner. And honestly, I know how much you absolutely hate those stuffy society parties. Vivian's friends can be a bit overwhelming. They talk about stock portfolios and golf all night." I closed my eyes, pressing my fingertips against my temples. She was actually doing it. My own flesh and blood, the child I had carried for 9 months and worked to the bone for, was walking me to the back of the bus and trying to convince me it was for my own comfort. "So you're uninviting me to Christmas Eve," I stated. It was not a question. No, of course not, Mama," Sarah countered quickly, her voice rising in defensive panic. "We just thought it would be so much better if you came over after dinner. You know, around 9 or 9:30, for dessert and coffee. That way you don't have to sit through 3 hours of boring charity talk with people you don't even know, and we can just relax and be family. It makes total sense, right? Come to the back door after the real guests have eaten. A year ago, I would have broken down and cried. I would have argued with her. I would have felt a jagged knife twisting violently in my chest. But on that day, sitting in my quiet kitchen, knowing exactly where her husband's money was going, I felt absolutely nothing but the cold, hard, clinical validation of a diagnosis confirmed. The cancer was completely terminal. "That sounds lovely, Sarah," I said, my voice smooth and utterly unbothered. "You're absolutely right. I don't have the patience for country club politics. I'll come by for dessert." Sarah exhaled loudly, a massive, shuddering breath of pure relief. "Oh, thank God. You're the best, Mama. I promise we'll make it special. I love you." "I'll see you soon, Sarah," I said, and gently ended the call. 3 days later, the universe handed me the perfect reason to visit the house on Maplewood Drive one last time before the holiday. A package of thick medical journals that I still subscribed to had been accidentally forwarded to their address instead of my apartment. I didn't call to ask if it was a good time. I didn't send a text message. I simply put on my heavy winter coat, picked up my purse, and drove over. It was a Wednesday afternoon, crisp and bitterly cold. I parked my car a full block away, an old ingrained habit from when I used to work night shifts and didn't want to wake my sleeping neighbors with the sweep of my headlights. I walked up the long driveway, my boots crunching softly against the dusting of fresh snow. Vivian's pristine white Lexus SUV was parked out front, gleaming in the pale winter sun. I slipped my silver key into the lock and pushed the heavy oak door open with practically no sound. The house was blissfully warm, smelling intensely of fresh pine needles from a massive Christmas tree and expensive vanilla-scented candles. From the grand sunroom at the back of the house, I could hear the faint, echoing sound of women's voices. I recognized Vivian's airy cadence, Sarah's softer tones, and the loud, braying laugh of Beatrice, one of Vivian's wealthiest pearl-clutching society cronies. I did not take off my coat, and I did not walk into the living room to announce my presence. I stayed in the shadowed hallway near the foyer, standing as still as a statue. And the caterer for the winter gala was simply dreadful, Beatrice was saying, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, dripping with casual privilege. But Vivian, darling, I have to say, this house is an absolute triumph. The natural light in this sunroom, the custom moldings. David must be making an absolute killing at the finance firm to afford a property like this in today's market. I heard the delicate clinking of porcelain teacups meeting saucers. Vivian let out a modest, entirely fabricated sigh. Oh, well, you know my David. He's brilliant. Of course, they had a little bit of help with the down payment, but the vision? The overall aesthetic of the home? That was entirely me. I simply couldn't let my only son live in some dreadful, cramped starter home. Thank God for you, Viv, Beatrice replied warmly. Though I must ask, how on earth do you manage the other grandmother? Sonia, is it? I saw her briefly at the wedding. She seems very, well, blue-collar. Doesn't she work the night shift at some public hospital downtown? I stopped breathing. I pressed my back flat against the cool plaster of the hallway wall, closing my eyes. Oh, Beatrice, it is an absolute cross to bear, Vivian said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, though it was still loud enough to carry through the open floor plan. Bless her heart, she tries, but she is so incredibly rough around the edges. She actually brought a greasy, homemade casserole to my pristine dining room last month. I had to throw it out the very moment she left. The smell was so overwhelming. She just doesn't understand our world at all. She's a bit of a charity case, emotionally speaking, always hovering around, always wanting to be included. How exhausting, Beatrice laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. Sarah, darling, how do you deal with it? This was it, the absolute moment of truth, the final agonizing heartbeat before the monitor flatlines. I waited for my daughter to speak. I waited for the girl whose tuition I had paid with my own blood and sweat to say, "Don't you ever talk about my mother like that. My mother bought the very roof over your head." Sarah let out a nervous, high-pitched giggle. Yeah, well, she's just set in her ways. She doesn't really get how things work now. It's exhausting, to be honest. I just try to manage her so she doesn't ruin Vivian's events. I just try to manage her. The betrayal was total. It was complete. She was not an innocent bystander caught between two warring mothers. She was an active, willing participant in my execution. I did not gasp. I did not cry. I simply turned around to leave. I had heard enough. I had received all the closure I would ever need for the rest of my natural life. But as I walked silently through the massive chef-style kitchen to get back to the front door, something caught my eye. Sitting dead center on the imported marble island, right next to an extravagant crystal vase overflowing with fresh white lilies, was a sleek black leather legal folio. It was sitting open. David must have been reviewing it over his morning coffee and forgotten to put it in his briefcase before rushing off to work. Normally, I would never pry into someone's legal documents, but after what I had discovered in his desk and what I had just listened to in the sunroom, the standard rules of societal engagement had fundamentally changed. I walked over to the kitchen island. The document resting inside the folio was printed on heavy, expensive watermarked legal paper. The heading at the top of the page was printed in bold, undeniable black letters. Quitclaim deed. My eyes scanned the dense, convoluted legal jargon, my brain translating it with ruthless, terrifying efficiency. A quitclaim deed is a legal instrument used to quickly transfer the title of a real estate property from one person to another, relinquishing all rights and interests without any warranty. Grantor: Sonia Miller. Grantee: the Vivian Sterling Irrevocable Family Trust. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. They weren't just trying to gently push me out of their elevated social lives. They were actively planning to steal my house. The house I had paid $280,000 in hard cash for. They were orchestrating a legal maneuver to transfer the deed directly into Vivian's protected trust fund, almost certainly to shield the asset from Vivian's mounting creditors and secure it as her own personal wealth. I looked down at the bottom of the page. My name was neatly printed on the signature line, just waiting for my signature, waiting for a notary's embossed seal. And then I saw the small, bright yellow sticky note attached to the front cover of the leather folio. The handwriting was unmistakably David's sharp, cramped scrawl. Sarah, make sure she has at least 2 large glasses of wine before I bring this up on Christmas Eve. Tell her it's just a standard tax restructuring document that Mr. Henderson recommended for the new year. Do not let her take it home to read. Do not let her take it home to read. The audacity. The sheer, unadulterated, breathtaking evil of it. They thought I was a stupid, tired, trusting old woman. They assumed that because I had spent my life serving them, because I loved them unconditionally, because I had calluses on my palms and wore sensible shoes, that I lacked the basic intellect to understand what they were doing to me. They were going to use our sacred holiday, the very first Christmas Eve we were spending without our traditional ham, without our private moments, to get me drunk and trick me into signing away my life savings so they could pay off Vivian's credit card bills. In the ER, when a patient crashes and starts coding, panic is your absolute worst enemy. You do not scream. You do not run around the room. You assess the patient's airway. You charge the defibrillator paddles. You clear the room, and you go to work. I did not take the folder. I didn't even bother to take a picture of it with my phone this time. I didn't need to. The true evidence of their crime wasn't the ink on the paper. It was their malicious intent. I walked out the front door, ensuring the lock clicked silently into place behind me. I walked back down the snowy driveway, right past the pristine white Lexus, and got into my cold Honda Civic. I sat there in the freezing car for exactly 1 minute. I looked down at my hands resting on my lap, the hands that had held Sarah when she took her very first struggling breath in the delivery room, the hands that had held Marcus's fading, fragile body when he took his last. These hands were officially done building tables for people who refused to offer me a seat. It was time to flip the entire table over. I pulled my phone out of my purse and dialed Marcus Henderson's direct cell phone number. He picked up on the first ring, the sound of rustling papers in the background. "Sonia?" Marcus asked, sounding slightly out of breath. "I was actually just reviewing the deed paperwork like you asked me to last month. The title is crystal clear. It's free and clear, solely in your name." "Marcus," I said, my voice vibrating with a lethal, terrifying calm. "Listen to me very carefully." "I'm listening," he replied, the rustling stopping immediately. "I want to sell the house on Maplewood Drive." There was a heavy pause on the line. Okay, Sonia, we can certainly do that. I can reach out to a few top-tier real estate agents in the area. We can get the property staged, listed on the MLS. "No," I interrupted, my tone slicing through his suggestions. "No agents, no open houses, no staging, no Zillow listings. I want this done quietly under the radar, and I want it done immediately." "Sonia, if you want a fast off-market cash close, you're going to take a significant hit on the asking price," Marcus warned, his lawyerly instincts kicking in. "You won't get true market value. You might lose $20,000, maybe $30,000 on the investment." "I do not care about the $30,000, I said flatly. "Consider it the required price of my piece. And consider it the cost of their tuition for the lesson they are about to learn." Marcus sighed heavily, clearly knowing there was absolutely nothing he could say to stop a woman who had made up her mind. "How fast do you want this closed, Sonia?" "Standard procedure is 30 to 45 days. "I want the legal papers signed, the funds wired and cleared in my account, and the ink completely dry by December 23rd. "Sonia, that's less than 2 weeks. Marcus sounded genuinely shocked. "That's a near impossible timeline for any traditional buyer to pull together inspections and funding." "Then find a non-traditional buyer," I countered fiercely. "Find a corporate investor. Find a commercial landlord. I don't care who buys the property, Marcus, as long as their check clears the bank." I paused, a sudden, brilliant, entirely ruthless thought flashing through my mind like a bolt of lightning. In my 35 years of living and working in this city, I knew a lot of people. You hear an incredible amount of high society gossip sitting in hospital waiting rooms and cafeteria lines. I knew exactly the kind of elite, cutthroat circles Vivian Sterling ran in, and I knew exactly who her biggest rival was. "Wait, Marcus," I said, leaning forward in the driver's seat. Do you still legally represent Eleanor Vance, the owner of Vanguard Elite Real Estate? Marcus hesitated. Yes, Eleanor is still a firm client of mine. But Sonia, Vanguard Elite, buys up residential properties to gut them and turn them into luxury corporate rentals for executives. They don't buy family homes to live in. A slow, dangerous, deeply satisfying smile spread across my face. Perfect. Call Eleanor right now. Tell her I have a pristine, newly renovated 4-bedroom colonial sitting right in the middle of Vivian Sterling's exclusive subdivision. Tell her I am willing to sell it to her for $20,000 under the appraised market value, cash in hand, only if we close the deal on the 23rd of December. Sonia. Marcus trailed off, understanding suddenly dawning on him. I could hear the mix of absolute awe and genuine fear in his voice. Eleanor Vance and Vivian Sterling have been at all-out war over the presidency of the Botanical Society for 5 straight years. If Eleanor Vance buys that house, she's going to legally evict Vivian's only son. It will be the biggest scandal to hit the country club in a decade. I am a trauma nurse, Marcus, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper of pure steel. Sometimes to save the patient's life, you have to break the breastbone. Call Eleanor. There was a long, profound silence on the other end of the line, followed by a firm, decisive nod in his voice. Consider it done, Sonia. I'll start drafting the purchase paperwork immediately. What do you want me to do about the current occupants? Draft a formal, legally binding 30-day notice of eviction, I commanded. Have the official courier standing by. When do you want the eviction notice served? Marcus asked softly. I looked at the beautiful house one last time. I looked at the grand, sweeping bay windows, the perfectly manicured, snow-covered lawn, and the white Lexus sitting in the driveway like a stolen crown jewel. They wanted me to come to the back door for a slice of dessert. They wanted me to drink their wine and sign away my life. They wanted a Christmas Eve they would never, ever forget. I was going to give it to them. I'll deliver it myself, I said into the phone, my voice striking the air like a judge's gavel. On Christmas Eve, right in the middle of dinner. In the emergency room, there is a strict, unyielding protocol known as triage. When a mass casualty event occurs, a multi-car pileup, a building collapse, a terrible fire, the paramedics and nurses cannot afford the luxury of sentimentality. You assess the bleeding, you check the airways, and you make cold, calculated decisions about who gets saved and who is simply beyond help. It sounds incredibly cruel to the layman, this act of walking past a dying person to help someone else, but it is the only way to operate in a disaster zone. Emotion will kill your patient. Surgical precision will save them. I was officially in triage mode. Sarah and David's marriage? Vivian's fragile ego? My own desperate, lifelong need to be unconditionally loved by my only daughter? They were all casualties now. They were marked with black tags. I was only interested in saving one life, my own. It took Marcus Henderson exactly 48 hours to set up the meeting. Eleanor Vance was a woman who commanded a room without ever having to raise her voice. She was the CEO and founder of Vanguard Elite Real Estate, but more importantly, she was the undisputed reigning queen of the local high society circuit. She and Vivian Sterling had been locked in a vicious, polite Cold War over the presidency of the Botanical Society and the Hospital Charity Board for the better part of 5 years. Eleanor was old money, the kind of money that whispers rather than shouts. She was ruthless, highly intelligent, and wore tailored Saint John knits like a suit of armor. I sat across from her in Marcus's mahogany-paneled conference room on a Thursday morning. Sonia, Eleanor said, her voice smooth, aristocratic, and tinged with genuine intrigue. Marcus tells me you have a property in the Whispering Pines subdivision, and that you are highly motivated to sell. I am, Eleanor, I replied, keeping my tone even and professional. 4 bedrooms, 3.5 baths, newly renovated chef's kitchen, custom moldings. It has a free and clear title. I'm asking $260,000. Cash, and we must close on the 23rd of December. Eleanor raised a perfectly sculpted, skeptical eyebrow. She picked up the thick appraisal file Marcus had slid across the polished table. 260? Sonia, darling, this house appraised for $290 just last spring. The market has only gone up. Why on earth are you willing to take a $30,000 loss for a 10-day close? Because I am evicting the current tenants on Christmas Eve, I said, my voice not wavering an inch. And I want the property to legally belong to someone who will not be swayed by their tears, their excuses, or their social standing. Eleanor flipped open the file and looked at the address printed on the first page. I sat silently and watched her eyes track the numbers. I watched the exact moment her sharp brain connected the address to the neighborhood, and then, inevitably, to the specific house. A slow, wicked, incredibly dangerous smile spread across Eleanor's lips. Wait a moment. 342 Maplewood Drive. Isn't that Vivian Sterling's son? David? I attended their housewarming party this past summer. Vivian gave a 10-minute toast about how she had personally selected the crown molding and imported the backsplash. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the table. Vivian Sterling does not own a single brick of that house, Eleanor. I do. And Vivian Sterling is currently drowning in over $60,000 of hidden credit card debt. Her son has been draining his own marital savings to keep her afloat and maintain her image. That is exactly why I had to buy the house in cash for them. They had no money left. Eleanor actually gasped softly. A look of pure, predatory delight washed over her perfectly contoured face. You are joking. Vivian is broke? Oh, this is absolutely delicious. She just publicly pledged $10,000 to the Winter Gala last week. A pledge she fully plans to pay by tricking me into signing the deed of the house over to her family trust on Christmas Eve, I stated matter-of-factly. That is why the house needs to be legally out of my name by the 23rd. Do we have a deal, Eleanor? Eleanor didn't even hesitate. She reached into her expensive Hermès Birkin bag, pulled out a heavy gold Mont Blanc fountain pen, and signed the preliminary purchase agreement with a flourish. Sonia, I don't just want to buy this house, Eleanor said, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the kill. I want to frame this newly recorded deed and hang it in my private locker at the country club. Vanguard Elite will wire the funds first thing on the morning of the 23rd. Thank you, Eleanor, I said, standing up to shake her hand. Oh, and one more thing. They are throwing a massive catered formal dinner on Christmas Eve. I need you to make sure your property management team is on standby on the 26th. I have a feeling they are going to be moving out in a terrible hurry. The next 10 days were an absolute masterclass in psychological compartmentalization. I went to my shifts at the clinic. I smiled warmly at my patients. I ignored the family group text chat where Sarah was frantically fussing over the floral centerpieces and the seating chart for Vivian's opulent party. I lived in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the clock to run out. On the morning of December 23rd, I sat in a leather chair in Marcus's office and watched my phone screen as the wire transfer cleared my bank account. $260,000. It was done. The house was officially gone. It was no longer my burden, my tether, or my trap. Marcus reached across his desk and handed me a thick, heavy manila envelope. The formal 30-day notice of eviction, Marcus said, his voice grave and deeply respectful. Signed, sealed, and legally binding. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this yourself, Sonia? I can easily hire a professional process server. It's Christmas Eve tomorrow. Given the crowd Vivian has invited, it is going to be an absolute bloodbath. I took the envelope, feeling the weight of the paper in my hands. A process server doesn't know how to stop the bleeding, Marcus, I said. I have to be the one to pull the plug. Christmas Eve arrived with a bitter, biting chill. The sky was dark, and a fresh layer of pristine white snow blanketed the city. I did not wear my sensible rubber-soled orthopedic shoes. I did not wear my comfortable, oversized knit sweaters or my practical slacks. I went to the very back of my closet and pulled out a tailored, deep emerald green wool pantsuit that I had not worn since I presented at a medical conference in Chicago 5 years ago. I put on my good pearls, the ones Marcus had given me on our 20th anniversary. I styled my hair meticulously. I wore a bold, unapologetic red lipstick. If I was going to my own execution, or rather if I was officiating theirs, I was going to look like the woman who signed the checks, not the tired woman who cleaned the dishes. I arrived at Maplewood Drive at exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. The street outside the house looked like a luxury car dealership. There were Mercedes sedans, sleek BMWs, and a Porsche Cayenne lining the curbs. Vivian had actually hired a professional valet service for a private residential dinner party. With my money, I handed my keys to the freezing red-nosed teenager in the valet jacket, tipped him a crisp $20 bill, and walked up the front steps of the house that used to be mine. I pushed the heavy front door open and was immediately hit by a wall of sound and scent. A live string quartet was situated in the corner of the foyer, playing a sweeping rendition of Carol of the Bells. The house smelled of roasting meats, expensive champagne, and heavy perfumes. Waitstaff in crisp white shirts and black bow ties were weaving gracefully through the crowded rooms, carrying silver trays of bacon-wrapped scallops and crystal flutes. Vivian's society friends were everywhere, wearing glittering cocktail dresses and tailored tuxedo jackets, laughing with their heads thrown back, exuding the effortless arrogance of the wealthy. And there, standing near the arched entryway to the formal dining room, was Sarah. She was wearing a stunning floor-length champagne-colored silk gown. She looked beautiful. She looked completely grown up. She looked like an absolute stranger. She saw me. Her bright hostess smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flash of genuine panic crossing her eyes before she hurried over, glancing nervously over her shoulder to see if anyone had noticed my arrival. "Mama," she hissed in a hushed, panicked whisper. "What are you doing here so early? I explicitly told you dessert wasn't until 9:30. We're just about to sit down for the main course. The chef is plating the duck." "Merry Christmas to you too, Sarah," I said loudly, my voice cutting cleanly through the ambient noise of the party. I decided I didn't want to miss the holiday toast. A few heads turned in our direction. The string quartet continued to play, but the conversation nearest to the foyer dipped slightly as people noticed the tension. Sarah grabbed my arm, her manicured fingers digging into my emerald sleeve, trying to physically pull me toward the kitchen hallway. "Mama, please, let's just go to the kitchen for a second. Vivian has the whole table mapped out. There's no place setting for you. You're going to ruin the arrangement." I yanked my arm free with sudden, sharp force. "Do not pull me, Sarah," I said, my voice dripping with ice. "I know the way to the dining room." I bypassed my daughter entirely and walked straight into the grand dining room. It was a breathtaking spectacle of excess. A custom mahogany table had been extended to seat 20 people. There were towering floral centerpieces of white roses and winter berries. Tall crystal candelabras cast a warm, flickering glow over the imported porcelain dinnerware. At the absolute head of the table sat Vivian Sterling. She was holding a flute of champagne, basking in the adoration of her peers, looking like a queen presiding over her court. David was seated immediately to her right, looking exhausted, pale, but dutifully attentive. When Vivian saw me enter the room, her face tightened so drastically it looked as though she had bitten into a raw lemon. But there were 20 elite witnesses present. She had a reputation to uphold. She had to play the gracious, magnanimous hostess. "Oh, Sonia!" Vivian projected her voice, letting out a fake, trilling laugh as she stood up. "What a surprise! Sarah, darling, I thought you said your mother was coming much later for coffee." I walked smoothly down the length of the room, stopping at the opposite end of the table, resting my hands calmly on the back of an empty, velvet-upholstered chair. "There's a change of plans, Vivian," I said, ensuring my voice carried to every corner of the room. "I'm not staying for dessert, but I did bring a gift." The room grew eerily quiet. Even the string quartet in the foyer seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere and began playing a little softer. People inherently love a spectacle, especially wealthy people who are secretly bored with one another. David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He saw my suit. He saw my posture. He saw the look in my eyes, and he knew with sudden, terrifying clarity that something was horribly wrong. "Sonia," David said, his voice trembling slightly, "let's go into my office. We can exchange gifts in private." I ignored him completely, keeping my eyes locked dead on Vivian. "Before I give you your gift, Vivian, I believe David has a document for me to sign tonight. Something about tax restructuring, a quitclaim deed, perhaps." David stopped dead in his tracks. All the remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. Sarah, who had trailed into the room behind me, let out a tiny, horrified gasp, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Vivian's eyes darted frantically around the room, taking in the confused, suddenly alert faces of her wealthy friends. Her carefully constructed mask was slipping, revealing the sheer panic underneath. I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about, Sonia," Vivian stammered, her voice trembling before she tried to regain her haughty tone. "Really, this is highly inappropriate. We are in the middle of a formal holiday dinner." I reached into my designer handbag, pulled out the sleek black leather folio I had found on the kitchen island days ago, and dropped it onto the mahogany table with a loud, resounding slap. "You know exactly what I'm talking about, Vivian," I said, my words dropping like stones into a glass pond. "A quitclaim deed. A legal document designed to transfer the title of this exact house from my name directly into the Vivian Sterling Irrevocable Family Trust. You planned to have me sign it tonight so you could leverage my equity to pay off the $64,000 in credit card debt you've been desperately hiding from every single person in this room. A collective audible gasp erupted from the dinner guests. Furious, scandalized whispering broke out instantly. 64,000? Beatrice gasped from halfway down the table, her hand clutching her pearls. Vivian, what on earth? Lies! Vivian shrieked, her voice rising to a shrill, panicked pitch. You are a liar. David, get this crazy woman out of my house immediately. She is having a psychotic break. It is not your house. I didn't yell. I projected from my diaphragm. It was the exact booming voice I used in the trauma bay when a patient was crashing, and I needed a room full of panicked interns to clear out of my way immediately. It hit the dining room like a physical shock wave. The whispering stopped instantly. The silence that followed was terrifying. I unclasped the manila envelope Marcus had given me. I pulled out the crisp official legal document. I bought this house, I said, walking slowly down the length of the table, my eyes locking onto David and Sarah. I drained my entire life savings to give my daughter a home because you, David, were hemorrhaging your marital savings to pay for your mother's luxury lifestyle. I stopped right next to Sarah. She was crying now, real ugly chest-heaving tears. Mama, please, Sarah sobbed, reaching out for me. Stop, I didn't know about the deed, I swear to God. I swear I didn't know. I looked at my daughter with absolute freezing detachment. I felt no pity. The triage was complete. Make sure she has 2 large glasses of wine. Tell her it's a tax document. Don't let her take it home. I quoted the sticky note verbatim, my voice devoid of mercy. That was the note your husband left for you, Sarah. Don't insult my intelligence, and do not ever lie to me again. I turned my attention back to Vivian. She was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white. Her chest was heaving. The grand illusion she had spent years building was completely shattered. Her friends were looking at her not with envy, but with pity, shock, and profound disgust. You wanted to push me to the back door, Vivian, I said, stepping closer to her. You wanted to make me the help. You wanted to steal the ground out from under my feet. But you made one critical, fatal miscalculation. You forgot who held the deed. I tossed the eviction notice directly onto Vivian's empty, gold-rimmed Versace dinner plate. Merry Christmas, I said. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. David found his voice, desperate and shaking. Sonia, you can't do this. You can't legally kick us out without due process. I'll fight this in court. I'll file an injunction tomorrow morning. A dark, chilling smile touched the corners of my mouth. You can certainly try, David, but you won't be fighting me. I don't own this house anymore. Another wave of frantic murmurs swept through the room. What do you mean you don't own it? Vivian whispered, her face an absolute mask of horror. I sold it, I replied calmly. Yesterday morning, it was a cash transaction. The new deed has already been filed with the county clerk. Sold it? To who? Vivian spat, her composure entirely gone. What kind of bottom-feeding slumlord would buy a house in 10 days? Oh, she's not a slumlord, Vivian, I said, enjoying the moment more than I had enjoyed anything in years. In fact, she is very eager to turn this property into a corporate rental. She actually told me she's going to frame the deed and hang it in her locker at the country club. I paused. I let the silence stretch for 3 full, agonizing seconds. I wanted every single society friend in that room to hear the name clearly. I sold it to Vanguard Elite Real Estate. I believe you know the CEO, Eleanor Vance. Absolute chaos descended. Beatrice actually dropped her wine glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor in a spray of red. Several guests gasped out loud. People began whispering frantically, the volume rising to a roar. Eleanor? Oh my God, Eleanor Vance purchased it. Vivian is completely ruined. No! Vivian screamed, her voice cracking as she clutched her chest, sinking back into her chair. No, you vindictive ghetto trash! You can't do this. Eleanor will destroy me. She'll tell everyone. She already knows, Vivian, I said, adjusting my handbag securely on my shoulder. And by tomorrow morning, the entire Botanical Society will know that your son is being evicted by your worst enemy because you couldn't afford to pay your credit card bill. David rushed forward, the chair scraping violently behind him. He grabbed my arm, tears streaming freely down his face. Sonia, please. Please, I'll stop the wire transfers. I'll cut her off completely. Just give us the money back. We'll buy it back from Eleanor. Please, you're making us homeless." I looked down at David's hand on my arm and then slowly brought my gaze up to meet his eyes. I spoke with a terrifying, hollow finality. "Take your hand off me." David let go immediately, stumbling backward as if he had been physically burned. "I didn't make you homeless, David," I said. "You did. You made yourselves homeless the moment you chose your mother's vanity over your wife's security." I turned to look at my daughter one last time. My beautiful girl weeping into her hands, the expensive champagne silk dress ruined by her tears, surrounded by the wreckage of a life built on lies. "You chose this too, Sarah," I said quietly, the anger finally giving way to a deep, resonant sadness. "I loved you enough to give you everything I had. You just didn't love me enough to give me a seat at the table, so I took the table back. I did not wait for a response. I didn't need to. The operation was over. The tumor had been excised, and the patient, my soul, was finally going to live. I turned my back on the grand dining room, on the shattered crystal, the panicked whispers, and the weeping women. I walked purposefully through the foyer, past the giant glittering Christmas tree and out the front door. The freezing night air hit my face like a baptism, and for the first time in 2 solid years, I took a deep, full, unencumbered breath. My lungs expanded. My chest didn't hurt. I walked down the snowy driveway to my Honda Civic. I tipped the wide-eyed valet another $20, got into the car, and started the engine. I turned the heater on full blast. I connected my phone to the Bluetooth. I didn't put on Christmas carols. I scrolled through my playlist and put on Nina Simone, feeling good. As I drove out of the Whispering Pines subdivision, leaving the blaring sirens of a monumental social disaster far behind me in my rearview mirror, I looked at myself in the mirror. I really looked at myself. I wasn't the tired, overlooked ER nurse anymore. I wasn't the disposable, invisible mother shoved into a basement. I was Sonia, and as the iconic, swelling horns of the music filled the car, I felt something I thought I had lost forever. I felt completely, undeniably free. In trauma medicine, there is a distinct, undeniable difference between surviving and healing. Surviving is the ugly, violent, chaotic act of stopping the bleed. It is the tourniquet, the chest tube, the electric shock of the defibrillator. It is painful, and it is entirely necessary. But healing? Healing is what happens in the quiet days that follow. It is the slow, agonizing process of the body knitting itself back together, scab by scab. It itches. It aches. And sometimes you have to break a bone that set incorrectly just so it can heal right the second time around. The weeks following that explosive Christmas Eve dinner were my healing process. The fever had finally broken. The social fallout in the Whispering Pines subdivision was nothing short of catastrophic. In elite circles, gossip is a currency far more valuable than gold, and Eleanor Vance made absolutely certain she was the wealthiest woman in town. By New Year's Day, every single member of the Botanical Society, the Hospital Charity Board, and the Country Club knew exactly what Vivian Sterling had tried to do. They knew about the $64,000 in hidden credit card debt. They knew about the quitclaim deed. They knew she was being evicted. But the most devastating explosion did not happen at the Country Club. It happened inside the walls of the house I had sold. I found out about it on the 2nd of January when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered it anyway. "Sonia," the voice said. It was hollow, raspy, and completely exhausted. It was David. "Hello, David," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice cracking slightly. I needed to tell you that you were right, about everything. And I wanted to tell you that I moved out." I paused, setting down the mug of tea I was holding. "You moved out? Or the eviction date was moved up?" "No," David swallowed hard. "I left Sarah. I'm staying at a motel near the interstate." This was the 4th twist in the tangled knot of our family. I listened quietly as David, completely broken by the weight of his mother's manipulation and his wife's betrayal, explained the aftermath of the dinner party. When the guests had fled and the caterers had packed up in awkward silence, David had demanded to see the leather folio. He read the quitclaim deed, but more importantly, he read the yellow sticky note. "I thought she was just easily influenced by my mother," David said, his voice breaking into a quiet sob. "I thought Sarah was just trying to keep the peace. But she knew, Sonia. She knew my mother was trying to steal your life savings, and she was going to pour you wine and let it happen. I've spent 2 years draining my accounts to protect my mother's lies, but I never tried to steal. Sarah crossed a line I can't even look at. When David realized his wife was not a victim, but a willing accomplice to fraud, whatever illusion of a perfect marriage they had completely shattered. He packed his bags that very night. "I'm sorry, David," I said softly, and I meant it. "I truly am." "Don't be," he replied. "You saved me from living a lie for the rest of my life. I just wish the truth didn't cost so much." The final climax of this ugly saga arrived on the 24th of January, the 30th day, moving day. Eleanor Vance had called me the day prior. Vanguard Elite was taking formal possession of the property, and Marcus Henderson needed me to be present for 5 minutes to sign a final transfer of liability form with the county sheriff, who was there to ensure the eviction was enforced. I drove up to Maplewood Drive at 10 in the morning. The sky was a pale, icy gray. Parked in the driveway were 2 massive moving trucks. Standing on the snow-covered front lawn were Eleanor Vance, her property manager, and 2 uniformed county sheriff deputies. And then there was Vivian. She was standing on the front porch, wearing a full-length mink coat, screaming at the top of her lungs at the movers who were carrying out her custom velvet armchairs. The haughty, whispering socialite was completely gone, replaced by a frantic, cornered animal. "Put that down! Be careful with that, you incompetent fools!" Vivian shrieked, her face flushed dark red. I stepped out of my car, buttoning my wool coat, and walked over to Marcus and Eleanor. Eleanor was sipping coffee from a paper cup, watching Vivian with a look of mild, detached amusement. "Good morning, Sonia," Eleanor said smoothly. "Quite the dramatic exit we're having." Before I could reply, Vivian spotted me. Her eyes widened, practically bulging out of her head. She marched down the porch steps, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at me. "You!" she screamed, spit flying from her lips. "This is all your fault. You ruined my family. You ruined my reputation. I will sue you for everything you have." "You don't have the funds to hire a lawyer, Vivian," Eleanor interjected coolly. "Now please step aside so my crew can finish stripping the house." Vivian looked at Eleanor, then at the deputies, and finally at me. She realized in that freezing moment that she had absolutely no power left. No money, no social standing, no obedient son to write her a check. She was completely trapped. And so, Vivian Sterling did the only thing a narcissist knows how to do when they have lost control of the narrative. She played the ultimate victim. Vivian let out a sudden, blood-curdling gasp. Her hands flew up to clutch her chest. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and with a theatrical, sweeping moan, she collapsed dramatically onto the snow-covered grass. "Oh my God!" one of the young movers yelled, dropping a lamp. The 2 sheriff deputies immediately rushed forward. Ma'am, can you hear me?" one of the officers shouted, pulling out his radio. "Dispatch, I need an ambulance at 342 Maplewood Drive, suspected cardiac arrest." "My heart," Vivian groaned weakly, her eyes fluttering closed. "The stress. She killed me." Eleanor took a step back, looking genuinely alarmed. I didn't panic. I didn't even blink. I had spent 35 years in an emergency room. I had seen real cardiac arrests. I had seen massive strokes, aneurysms, and pulmonary embolisms. I had also seen hundreds of drug seekers and cornered criminals fake medical emergencies to avoid going to jail. I walked calmly through the snow, right past the panicked deputies, and stood over Vivian's prone body. "Officer, cancel that ambulance," I said, my voice cutting through the crisp winter air with absolute authority. "Ma'am, step back. She's having a heart attack," the young deputy insisted, looking terrified. "I am a licensed trauma nurse with 35 years of clinical experience," I barked, dropping to my knees beside Vivian. "She is not having a heart attack. She is having a temper tantrum." I reached down and grabbed Vivian's limp right arm. In medicine, there is a very simple, foolproof test to determine if a patient is truly unconscious or if they are experiencing what we call pseudosyncope, faking it. I lifted Vivian's arm high up in the air, holding her hand directly over her own face. If a person is truly unconscious, they have no muscle tone, and their hand will drop straight down and smack them right in the nose. But the human brain is hardwired for self-preservation. Even if you are trying desperately to play dead, your subconscious will not allow you to hit yourself in the face. I let go of her arm. Vivian's arm plummeted downward, but at the very last possible millisecond, her hand miraculously swerved to the left, landing harmlessly in the snow next to her ear. I looked up at the two deputies. Notice how her hand avoided her face? A truly unconscious patient lacks the motor reflexes to do that. To be absolutely certain, and to prove a point, I balled my hand into a fist and pressed my knuckles hard into the center of Vivian's chest, executing a firm sternal rub. It is a highly uncomfortable pain stimulus used to wake unresponsive patients. Vivian let out a sharp shriek, her eyes snapping wide open, and she slapped my hand away furiously. "Get your hands off me!" she yelled, sitting bolt upright in the snow, her mink coat covered in wet grass. Her pulse is strong, her airway is clear, and her neurological reflexes are perfectly intact, I announced loudly to the officers, standing up and brushing the snow off my knees. It's a miraculous recovery. The young deputy stared at Vivian, his face hardening as he realized he had been played. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, cancel the bus. Suspect is conscious and alert. No medical emergency." He looked down at Vivian, who was sitting in the snow, her face burning with the ultimate, undeniable humiliation. She had tried to play the dying martyr, and she had been exposed as a complete fraud in front of the police, her worst enemy, and the woman she had despised. "Get up, Mrs. Sterling," the deputy said coldly, "and get off this property before I arrest you for filing a false police report." Vivian scrambled to her feet, clutching her coat around her. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Eleanor. Stripped of her dignity, her lies, and her audience, she walked silently to her car, got in, and drove away. That was the last time I ever saw Vivian Sterling. The karma that followed her was swift and absolute. Without David to quietly pay her massive credit card minimums, the banks descended like vultures. Within 2 months, her luxury-gated condo was foreclosed on. The charity board officially asked for her resignation, citing reputational concerns. Beatrice and the other country club ladies simply stopped returning her phone calls. The last I heard through the hospital grapevine, Vivian had moved into a cramped one-bedroom apartment in a run-down industrial part of the city, the exact kind of working-class neighborhood she had spent her entire life mocking. Life has a beautiful, poetic way of balancing the scales. 6 months passed. The brutal winter melted into a bright, blooming spring, and then settled into a warm, golden summer. I thrived. Without the constant, heavy weight of Sarah and David's financial and emotional crises on my shoulders, I discovered a woman I hadn't seen since my 20s. I took up pottery. I joined a book club. I started sleeping 8 full hours a night. The chronic pain in my joints didn't magically disappear, but it became a dull hum rather than a roaring fire. In late June, I received a text message from Sarah. We had not spoken since the night of the Christmas Eve dinner. "Mama, if you are willing, I would really like to see you. I don't want anything. Just coffee, please." I thought about it for 2 days. I talked to my pastor. I looked at Marcus's picture on my bedside table. Finally, I texted her back with the address of a neutral, quiet coffee shop downtown. When I walked into the cafe, Sarah was already sitting in a corner booth. The change in her appearance was startling. The designer clothes, the expensive blowout, the air of suburban entitlement, it was all gone. She was wearing a simple pair of jeans and a plain cotton blouse. She looked older. She looked tired. She looked real. I sat down across from her. She looked up, and her eyes immediately filled with tears. "Hi, Mama," she whispered. "Hello, Sarah," I replied, keeping my hands folded in my lap. "Thank you for coming," she said, nervously shredding a paper napkin. "I didn't think you would. I am a mother, Sarah. I will always answer the door, but you are not allowed inside the house anymore until I know you've wiped your feet." She let out a wet, choked laugh, tears spilling over her cheeks. "I deserve that. I deserve a lot worse." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "I'm sorry, Mama. I am so, so sorry. Not for the house, not for the money. I'm sorry that I made you feel invisible. I'm sorry that I let that woman treat you like garbage because I was too cowardly to stand up for my own mother. I forgot who you were, and I forgot who I was." I looked at my daughter. For the first time in years, I didn't see the influence of Vivian Sterling. I saw the little girl who used to hold my hand in the grocery store. I saw the young woman whose college tuition I had paid with overtime shifts. "Are you and David still separated?" I asked gently. She nodded, wiping her eyes. "Yes, we're in couples counseling, but I don't know if we'll make it. He can't forgive me for the quitclaim deed. And honestly, I can't forgive myself. I'm living in a studio apartment across town. I'm working extra hours at the marketing firm just to pay my own rent. She wasn't asking for a handout. She wasn't hinting that she needed money. She was simply stating the facts of the bed she had made. I forgive you, Sarah, I said, and as the words left my mouth, I felt the last lingering scab fall away from my heart. I meant it. But you need to understand something. The dynamic we had is dead. I am not your safety net anymore. I am not your bank. I am not your punching bag. I know, Sarah said, reaching across the table and lightly touching my hand. I don't want a safety net. I just want my mom back, even if we have to start from scratch. I turned my hand over and squeezed her fingers. Then we will start from scratch, slowly. We drank our coffee. We talked about her job. We talked about my pottery class. It was tentative, like two people learning to walk on a fractured leg that had just come out of a cast. But it was a start. It was the beginning of true healing. Today, I am 63 years old. I am sitting on the sun-drenched wooden deck of a luxury cruise ship, currently docked somewhere off the coast of the Bahamas. The sky is an impossible, brilliant shade of blue, and the ocean breeze smells of salt and freedom. I used a portion of the $260,000 I got from Eleanor to book a 14-day, all-inclusive Caribbean cruise, a suite with a balcony. The exact trip Marcus and I used to dream about when we were putting $20 bills into an envelope in our 20s. I look out at the horizon, holding a glass of iced tea, and I realize that the young ER residents were right. You can absolutely die from 1,000 paper cuts. You can bleed out from giving too much of yourself, piece by piece, to people who do not value the sacrifice. But if you are brave enough to recognize the symptoms, if you are strong enough to stop the bleeding, to walk away from the table, and to demand your own worth, you don't have to die. You can be resurrected. My name is Sonia. I am a mother, a widow, a retired nurse, and a homeowner. The price of my peace was incredibly high. It cost me a house. It cost me 2 years of heartache, and it nearly cost me my daughter. But as I sit here, feeling the warm Caribbean sun on my face, and knowing that I am finally, truly respected, I would pay it twice over.